Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
All right. Thanks everyone for coming out. And I'm really excited today to be able to introduce Nick Sousanis. I've known Nick for quite some time, watched him as he's gone through many adventures. Nick is he's a mathematician, entrepreneur, artist, and recently a graduate student at Teachers College at Columbia University, where he is writing his dissertation entirely as a graphic novel. And this is a really interesting work because it's all about visual and verbal discourse and the differences, the strengths and the weaknesses, the trade-offs between them. And it's the first of its kind. So he's been getting a little bit of attention lately. He's been in the Chronicle of Higher Education. He gave a talk at Stanford lately. And we have a show here that's opening right after this, where we're going to show some of his work. And he's here today to talk to you about unflattening. So, and this is an interactive, for those of you online, this is an interactive presentation. So if you have some paper and a pen and some kind of surface, make them handy because you'll need them later on. And without further ado, I guess I'll just hand it over to you. So welcome, Nick.
Thanks. Well, thank you all for coming, and thank Microsoft Research and Studio 99 and Donald. And I don't know how many of you work with Donald, but the opportunity to work with him and see just such enthusiasm to make things happen, it's really a treat. So all of you who do work with him, you're really lucky, and if you don't, you should find a way to. There will be an interactive part, but that'll be a little later. So I'm doing this doctorate in comic book form, and as you may guess, there aren't a lot of other, this is a little bit unusual in the academic setting. So a big question people say is, how do you get away with this? You know, that's almost always the first question. So the truth of the matter is, this is not something I didn't come to Columbia and say, I'm going to now make comic books. I came as a comics maker with a lot of background in that. So I thought I'd give you a tiny bit of history on my background with comics before we get into some of the specifics. I'm one of those kids, well, my older brother was a comics reader, so I'm one of those kids whose first word is Batman, which there's a lot of us now, I think. And I think part of that, I work with students in them teaching comics in their classrooms. And I think the literacy elements of comics is a big thing, and I can certainly attest to that anecdotally because, you know, my experience with reading came really fast because I was reading comics when I was very small. So later in junior high and high school, I produced my own comic. I did a superhero series for quite a while. But then I went to college, and in college, it seemed like you're supposed to do serious things, and I really liked mathematics and things like that, and so I kept doing comics, but they were always on the side. Always this thing that I did if I had time to get to it, but never the main focus of what I did. So that continued for a number of years, and I was in Detroit for a long time, and I worked around the arts. I wrote about art shows and that sort of stuff. And at the last minute was asked to be in a political art show with about 4 days to go. And so the only thing I could come up with was, I can make a comic. So I made, it was right before the 2004 election and right after. Yeah, I heard that. So this piece, this is the second of those two pieces. It's called The Show of Hands. It's about voting. The sort of visual verbal metaphors that came out of that really resonated with how I would work in the future and sort of triggered me getting back into comics. So there was this piece, and then about a year later we organized an exhibition around games and art and education. And that piece I did the essay in comic book form. So it's about a 16-page comic that deals with the history of games, how games work, and then sort of applies it, sort of philosophy of life through games. And so when I was coming to Columbia, I said, I had this document I'd made and said, this is the kind of thing I can do. So they bought it. said, all right, we can, this is the kind of thing you can do. We're going to let you do it. So I continued to make comics for a lot of my assignments. This is about Professor Maxine Green. She's a professor of aesthetic education, who's in her late 90s or mid 90s. I had her class in her living room. She's really amazing if you want to look her up, Maxine Green. But yeah, so to me, making, I just said, why not? Why not make comics as academic work? But when you're actually in academia, and those of you who've come through it, you know that that's a little bit more of a challenge than you might otherwise think. So part of my argument has been to argue for the legitimization of this work. I had to argue for itself. I didn't set out to argue for itself. I set out just to do it, because why not? But now I had to both argue for itself and do this larger thing. So what I'm going to take you through is the larger argument, which is about education, and then the tighter thing, which is very specific about how comics work in visual thinking. And so to start, I call this work unflattening, so I should let you know what flatness means. And so by flatness, I mean sort of a flatness of sight, a flatness of possibilities. I don't mean literal flatness at all. And I liken it to, if you're familiar with the sociologist Herbert Marcuse, his expression, a pattern of one-dimensional thought and behavior. It's the kind of thing where like all the possibilities are already chosen for you. So there's really just one way of thinking. So the other thing I connect this to, and I would guess people here are familiar with Edwin Abbott's book Flatland from the 1880s. And in Flatland, it's about these geometrical inhabitants of a two-dimensional plane, and they're capable of moving east and west and south and northwards, but they have no concept of upwards. They have no idea how to move off that plane. They can't even imagine the idea that there's something off of the plane. And so I feel like what flatness is this lacking the critical dimension to step out of what we know, in the same way that flatlanders only can know the plane. And I think, or I fear really, that despite a lot of well-meaning things that are going into education and the institutions around school, that they are complicit in creating flatness and perpetuating flatness. So I think this starts out really early. We're put on tracks at the beginning of school and sort of divided out. And learning becomes something that it's more recipe. These are things done to us at certain steps along the way rather than experiences that we have. And these things happen in boxes. And they happen in boxes of space, like this room, and they happen in boxes of time, like you have one period to do this subject, and they happen in periods of subjects as well. So everything is organized into these different boxes. And I think in being sort of indoctrinated by boxes, that we tend to take those boxes inside ourselves. We internalize that. So the idea of somebody who studied mathematics and studied art is weird in this culture, because we're in multiple boxes. Maybe not in this building. This might be a building where that's more embraced than other places. But I can say from experience that folks that are in multiple boxes, that is not always welcomed or understood. And I think the tools we're using to assess the human, which is this very complex, capable, amazing creature, we try to compare that to other kinds of boxes that don't look anything like this. And so converting the human into data, I think it limits us, and I think it flattens us. And so maybe, when Da Vinci made this drawing and said that, in humanity we could see the whole universe, I think maybe that was in our hubris to make statements like that. But the flip side of that is to stick us in the bubbles that testing puts us through, is starting to limit us and sort of align us in one dimension. And the effect of this, I think, again, despite well-meaningness, is that things get standardized. They get put in line, in row upon row, and we end up being flattened. So I want to come back to how early this starts. This is something that really struck me, and it's been a guiding force throughout this whole project. The New York Times reported, getting close to 3 years ago now, the decline in the sale of picture books. There's a big decline in the sale of picture books, and the publishers said that the reasons that they stated was that parents wanted to get their kids into chapter books at earlier and earlier ages. This is 3, 4, and 5-year-olds. And the reasons that they wanted to do that is because the kids had to take standardized testing. And standardized testing required that they be able to do all these verbal things. And so parents want their kids to do well meaning again. And so they throw out picture books because that's not important. But chapter books, word books are the way to go. And this is for 4 and 5-year-olds. Bless you. So obviously a big focus of what I'm doing is to challenge text. And so this is a page from my dissertation. It's the only page that looks like this. But if you look at every other dissertation ever done in the last few hundred years, maybe not, I don't know how long the typesetting has been like this, but for a while, they look a lot like this, except for the burn marks and some of the other parts. And I think we've had this bias for the verbal linguistic being the way we think for a long time. And I'm here tracing it back to Plato, who looked at the reed bent by water. And I think you'd be familiar with that. You put a straw or something in water, and it looks like it's bent. And so he'd say, well, you can't trust your eyes, because your eyes are deceiving you. And so, it all became, well, it's pure thought. And pure thought was more like inner speech. Descartes picks this kind of thing up. And let me back up, sorry. I think the other side, so that's about what we see, but the other aspect of that is images themselves. So if you can't trust what we can see when you're making an image, that's a shadow of a shadow already. So you really can't trust images. So Descartes takes that and sort of doubles down on it, and his experiment with the wax candle. So the wax melts, and then when it cools off, the wax hardens again. So he says, well, I saw it being fluid and I saw it being solid, so obviously my senses are wrong because it's still the same thing. So he throws out sense experience altogether, say, I distrust that. And I think continues with that, sort of dissect what makes us human and reduce us to thinking machines. And obviously that came with some great advances, but also some really difficult things for us. So consider this. Consider that language is like a sea that we swim in. It's the thing that we breathe in. And so it's a powerful tool. It enables lots of possibilities. But at the same time, in sort of defining what we're able to see, what we're able to know, it can also confine what we're able to know. It can limit what we can see. So it's a tool and a trap all at once. And just to give you an example, if we think about maps as a kind of language, you're familiar, of course, with the standard Mercator projection of the Earth. You take the world, which is this very complex thing. Then you think about that as experience. Experience is all over, and the globe is all over. And you flatten it out, and you know that distortions happen when you flatten things out like that. And you know that the information is lost, and it has to be. It has to be. Any language has to flatten things out. And so then you look at Buckminster Fuller's Dymaxion map, and he flattened it out in a different way. And it shows connections, it shows other things, but it's also losing kinds of information. So any language that we think through in the way that a thermometer can only tell us one thing about the weather. If you look at a thermometer and you say, I know the weather, you're missing a lot of pieces. And so let's think specifically about text and image. Text unfolds linear, like a chain. Things that words are connected to each other in this sequence. Image, on the other hand, is all over. It's all connected to each other, and you take it in all at once. So you're familiar with this, sort of the tree-like structure of how we break down language. I'm sure you still spend a lot of time diagramming sentences. And the flip side, if you're familiar with the term rhizome, something that's all interconnected, all the roots are, there's no center structure like a tree would have. But an image is much more like that. So it's all over, all at once. So there are different ways of perceiving reality. And so the question, and maybe the guiding question for my work, is what have we been missing when we see through only, when we rely on only one way of looking? It's not to say that one way is bad or one way is better. It's to say, what do we miss out on when we rely on just a single way of thinking? And so comics. For me, I think of comics as amphibious. something where I can breathe in both mediums. They can be visual and verbal, and I can exist and see from both sides of those borders and maybe get a little sense of the things that I've been missing. And maybe that's a way that you can start to step out and gain perspective on the situations you find yourself trapped in. So it's a way of sort of pivoting away from one center, sort of the pre-Copernican models of the Earth. We pivot away from that single center, and we start coming at things from two eyes, from 2 points. And this is really common, and I mean, we live with this every second of our lives, but we see through 2 eyes, and those 2 eyes are always giving us 2 different views. You take this for granted, but the fact that you're able to do that is it's what makes you able to catch a ball. It's what makes you able to navigate this space. Those 2 different views work together to give you perspective. So a big idea of what I'm doing is saying, look, let's see not only let's get past one perspective, and let's get 2 or maybe even many. Let's look from many points. And it's not to denigrate the disciplines, the single disciplines, or any particular language. It's just to say that when we start to bring them together, when we start to look from the multiple ways that people make sense of the world, then we can see a bigger picture. We can explore new possibilities. And I think some of those distances are necessary. Sort of being apart from each other gives you greater perspective. And holding those 2 things in relationship, not saying not at odds, but how do you make sense? How do if your eyes don't talk to each other correctly, you have problems. If you're significant other and you don't learn to talk to each other properly, there's problems. So, it doesn't mean there aren't differences, but those differences need to speak together, and from that we gain possibilities. So my definition of unflattening, which I may read to you, but it kind of came out of, who's familiar with Eratosthenes finding the circumference of the Earth? A couple of you are. Okay. So what he did on the solstice, he knew that down south in Syene that the sun at noon was directly overhead and there was no shadow in the well. So the sun went straight down to the bottom of the well. But up in Alexandria, where he was at the very same time, there was a slight shadow. So he, doing some pretty simple geometry, and knowing that the sun's rays were all hitting the Earth straight, calculated the circumference of the Earth from that. And this page, it's a pretty simple explanation, and you could do this thing yourself with somebody far away from you. And so for me, my definition of unflattening is a simultaneous engagement of multiple vantage points from which to engender new ways of seeing. So it's all about how do we see from more than one point at a time. And if you're thinking of I think a big part of, I wandered a little bit in the labs last night. There's people looking from different places, and as those intersections happen, what more expansive possibilities come out of that? And I want to make a side note here to stress that I talk about ways of seeing, and I am very specifically focused on visual and verbal. But by ways of seeing, I really mean something more metaphorical about ways of seeing as sort of ways of perceiving the world. So I use the example of my dog to say his sense of smell, which the dog's sense of smell is not just more powerful, but it's more nuanced. So a dog might walk into this room and smell the speaker that was here 7 days ago and one that was here 6 days ago, and have all those sort of layers of experience that we don't even have concepts of. So I use the example here to say, look, I talk about ways of seeing, but your ways of seeing maybe have nothing to do with making visuals. It may have some other thing. But since I am talking about ways of seeing, for me, comics let me not only talk about seeing and talk about the importance of visual thinking, but I can actually walk that talk. I mean, in the academia, there's been lots of talk about visual thinking and its importance, but a lot of it looks like text. All right, all of it looks like text. So comics let me get at these things from the place that they're actually trying to address. And I think, comics have been around a long time, but they've gotten a bad name, and they have a bad name. This is changing now, but I think our connotations with the word comics are unfortunate. It's a children's medium, it's whatever, and then they gave it the name graphic novels, which is an excellent marketing term, but it has some odd connotations as well. So we call it lots of different things, but the truth is, I don't think of comics as a new medium or even a newish medium. I think of them as part of a long lineage that goes back to ways we made sense of the world before we could use words. So I'm not saying this is comics, but I'm saying making images to make sense of things, that's been with us since we could be us. So a little bit specifically about how comics work. This first part will jump off Scott McCloud. And if you're interested in comics at all, you know who Scott McCloud is. But if you're getting interested in comics at all, you should know who Scott McCloud is. He wrote a book called Understanding Comics in 1993, and it's a comic about comics. It's really a phenomenal read. If you're interested in comics, it's a phenomenal read. If you're interested in design, it's a phenomenal read. If you're interested in being human, it's really worth it. So we'll start with him and then diverge as we go on our definitions here. So for McCloud, comics are juxtaposed pictorial and other images in deliberate sequence. Essentially, he's saying they're sequential art. So that the simple version of that, if I put my fist like this and I draw a box around it, and then I put my fist like this, draw a box around it, you guys make the connection and you know that a punch was thrown, even though nothing actually moved. So static images, you linked them together in your head, you made a gestalt of it, and you made meaning out of those separate images. So that's his groundwork for what comics are. You string images together, that becomes a comic. It separates it from visual art, and it separates it from text in other ways. This is my page sort of taking all of his thinking and putting it into my own work. But one aspect of that is that time, he's saying time equals space, and I wrote here time is written in space. And so that idea, the passage of time, like I drew the two boxes, is, no time unfolded, but the passage of time happened from this space to this space. So, for instance, in this sort of winding sequence here, and it's a little too hard to see, but there's a larger one out there. I took the idea of sequence and the idea of seasons and put them together. So our experience of the seasons is something that happens in sequence. Things move along. And I think this is my redrawing of a lunar calendar from about 30,000 years ago, that people were recording time in space a long time ago. They did it in things like that. They did it in things like Stonehenge. They made sense of sequence by marking it in space. So I think we can think about the way this aspect of how comics work is also something very old. And the other part, which we already alluded to before, is that the reader is really, really involved in this. The reader's involved in making the connections between here and here. And so unlike animation where the thing unfolds, you're doing the animating. You're bringing it to life. So yes, comics are sequential in the ways that text is sequential, but the other aspect to that is that they are also a visual medium. They are images, and we've talked about images earlier. Images is something you take in all at once. So yes, I do read the sequence step by step by step by step by step, but at the same time, I am making connections up and back and down and across because I can't help but see the whole. I can't help but make those connections. So some people call this more like a network, to see that whole thing all at once. And there's my little joke here is that this whole page is really one with everything. There are no separate elements. They hold together because you see the whole at once. And so this is an example from Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons' Watchmen, which is a very well-known book and well worth reading. But in the center panel, this character, who's sort of displaced in time, I think is making meta-commentary about how comics work. So in the center panel, he says, there is no future, there is no past, do you see? And what he's really saying is, this isn't the future panel, and in fact, that's said in the past. This isn't the future panel either, and that's not a past panel. Those panels are all taking place at the same time. So there is no separation between future and past in the comics, except how it's marked off in space. So for me, this makes me think about how we think. And I want to sort of go to cognitive science for just a tiny second. This is based on the work of Ian McGilchrist, who wrote a book called The Master and His Emissary. And he's talking about the split between left and right brain, which is traditionally thought of as left being verbal and right being visual. And he's sort of throwing most of that out, but saying that, yes, there is significant differences, and there are differences in how we pay attention to the world. And he's saying that the left is very much about paying attention linear, very focused, and very narrow kind of way of sequences. And that the right is sort of this global, all over broad awareness, which you can relate to visual and verbal, but they're not that neatly mapped. So if you think about this evolutionarily, it's important to be able to pay very close attention to something, to do work, to make something, to make a tool. But at the same time, if you don't have broad awareness, you're about to get eaten. So you need to have, to have these two brains talking to each other and working together to survive in the world. So for me, I see comics as sort of holding two different ways of paying attention to the world in one sense, the sequential and the simultaneous. And I think that makes comics really cool, because it makes them stand apart from other ways of communicating. So maybe I'll give you a few of what I think are neat implications of this. This is from Art Spiegelman's Maus, which is familiar to people. But I think, so this simple example, this is sort of a timeline within what they're talking about. In text, I would put this as a footnote, or I would put it on the end of the book, or I would have to do or a sidebar. Sidebars are horrible. Because, and here's why I say sidebars are horrible, because you don't know when you're supposed to read it. And it matters when you're supposed to read it, and you get lost. And I go down to my footnote, and then I got to find my way back up to text, if that's how it is. So comics, because they're hold together visually, but they also can be kept apart visually, because you know that this is separate, but you also see the whole. Comics can hold things together even as they allow things to be separate. This is an example from Watchmen again. It's a pretty simple sequence. There's a story taking place in this room in California, and at the same time there's something they're talking about that's happening in New York. And the scenes are kept separate. They're sort of interlaced, but they're kept separate by the fact that they're colored. You can see the X panels are different than the darker panels. So they can both hold together, and he can have two different things happening at once. And this is a reason for those of you who happen to see the film, which I've not heard much good about, but the film can't handle that. Film is going to do things, it has to go on and on and on, and comics can spread things out in this spatial way. This is just a pretty simple example, but the fact that there's these separate little moments, but if you pull back and notice, there's a larger shape going on that's actually speaking to what he's investigating. This is a French author. This is Gasoline Alley from a long time ago, but this is just a pretty neat example where there's a sequential thing. There's the guys bumbling through the beach, but there's a simultaneous scene that he's moving through. So you've got those two ways of thinking stuck together. Similarly from Gasoline Alley, same kind of thing, where sort of it's one scene, but you're supposed to read it sequentially. Two modes of reading stuck together. And this is just funny, but I really like it. This is something you can really only do in comics. This poor little guy can't get the apple out of the tree, can't get it, he gets an idea, and so he walks up the hill. Because these are in the same space, he's able to get the apple. Similarly, his game of keep away backfires because people can reach through panels, because they can intersect in space. Okay, so the sort of ecosystem, this simultaneous sequential ecosystem allows some other things. It allows us to directly integrate visual and verbal. I mean, I've been talking about two modes of how we pay attention, but visual and verbal more specifically. So words can become visual elements. So they not only help us sort of move through the page and how they are oriented, but they can become visual elements and integrated in that way. And their interactions. The interaction, which I talk about as refraction here, and that's to a part that I didn't show slides of. The way that they sort of bend meaning when you're reading in one, you're reading text and then you see the picture, and then that sort of contributes back and forth, and there's a resonance between the two. And it really, in ways like if you think about magazines, which also have pictures and words, there's text and then there's image. And so there is some resonance, but in the case of here, we're constantly going back and forth between the two modes of reading. And I just grabbed a couple examples here, this is from an Alan Moore comic about 9/11. But I just think it's a wonderful one. With the upper left, he says, images, of course, also carry information. Every bit as powerfully, they express symbolically feelings beyond the reach of language. And I think that's sort of speaking to what's going on speaking to what's going on in the panels, but it's sort of speaking to what comics can do. They can give you images that do things that text doesn't do, and they can give you text that does things that the images can't do. And this is a simple example from The Flash, but just the flow of word balloons tells you where to move. This is from a Batman and Robin comic where the text becomes a graphic. And these are fun. Seems to be it's clever, but it's how do you deal with the silence of this medium and then sort of make it visual. And that goes into, I'm sure at conferences things you guys have seen visual facilitation or sketchnoting. And I think that comics have some they're not very much about stories or sequentialness, but they're very much about how words and pictures interact. And the other aspect that comics facilitate is the multimodal. And multimodal, very simply, is saying that it's not just text, but things like gesture, image, action all contribute ensemble to the meaning. And they're not add-ons, they're all part of it. So my page here is sort of talking about, unlike Descartes' thing, communication isn't just these dots that go across. It's expressed in how we gesture, how angry, how loud, whatever those things are, and you can make them visual. And we have all this sort of signs and symbols that we can utilize and make part of the visual page. So one example, this is Asterias Polyp by David Mazzucchelli. And it's really, if you're interested in multimodality or comics or both, it's awesome. And in this panel, so there's the two actors and they're doing whatever they're doing. And then there's the text, which is sort of telling you what's happening. But then the colors that they're rendered in is giving you information. The way that they're rendered, and hers is this sort of rendered, sort of soft lines, and his is obviously very geometric, stylized form. On top of that, the fonts that they're speaking in and the shape of their word balloons. So there's all these layers of visual information, this multimodal stuff coming at you, that whether you're aware of it or not, you're taking it in all at once. And it's making something that looks as simple as a Peanuts cartoon incredibly dense and powerful in what it can communicate in seemingly simple form. And this kind of stuff I threw in. This is a slide from Edward Tufte's book. The information design. I think comics start to have overlaps with that as well, and I won't speak to that. So this brings me to sort of what do our thoughts look like? What is the shape? What is the shape that our thoughts are before we get them out? We get them out in things like words. We get them out in pictures. But what are they? What do they look like? And for me, I know I tend to talk in parentheticals a lot. There are all these sort of sidetracks, and I always bring up my grandmother, whose stories, as many grandmothers probably do, all had, I was going, and then, and that neighbor, and then all of a sudden we're hearing about, so that it's something that's not always great in conversation, but I think in comics, the sort of tangential and the sidetracks can be utilized really well. And this is Chris Ware, who's a really wonderful contemporary cartoonist, and if you don't know, highly recommend. But Ware is really a master of slow moments of recreating memory in space and having the sort of sequential moments, but also these simultaneous things happen that really gets at how you'd tell a story or how you'd think about what happened that day. And it's using the space in very different ways than you may have thought of comics in the past. It's not dot, 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 dot. It's all over. And so every element here, every side turn you make to move back, to come back, all has meaning. That whole shape of the page is telling you something. And in that way, it's very much like architecture. And for me, I think comics are so much about how you arrange the space. And my pages take forever to make. And they take forever to make not because I'm slow at drawing, even when the drawing is incredibly dense and intense, which I tend to go for. But that's not what takes, that takes a while, but that's not what takes so long. What takes so long is figuring out how to have the space convey the meaning. And so we're going to pause from the me talk a lot part and we're going to turn this to you. So I'm going to explain the exercise. Are you guys ready? Yeah. Okay, so it's a little bit more comics theory, and then the exercise begins. So this is Little Nemo from 1908 or something like that. And comics are often compared to storyboarding. And you're familiar with storyboarding from movies. Storyboarding, but what storyboarding does is you decide what goes in the panel and you draw it, and you decide what goes in the next panel and you draw it, and they're all the same size, and they're all, so you get to choose what happens within, but after that, the choices are kind of done. In comics, you not only choose what goes inside these containers, but you choose what's the shape of that container, what's the size of that container, what's its relationship to the things next to it, and what spot on the page is it on. So in this thing, if we whited out the content of this, you'd see, this sort of same size thing, and then all of a sudden the panels would grow, and then they would grow some more, and then at the end they would shrink back down. So the panels, I think, are starting to tell you the story. You're not convinced. These panels are telling a different story. I mean, this sort of is establishing a rhythm in that kind of grid. This is a Chris Ware one that's mostly just crazy, but maybe it'll give you an idea. This is a Frank Miller piece from The Dark Knight Returns. Again, this sort of beat, beat, beat. I mean, that's a very different meaning being conveyed than what happens here. He's slowing you down or speeding you up in ways that here, it's very rhythmic. This is a modern, few years old, WE3 by Frank Quitely, sort of using the kind of bullet time from the Matrix and video game stuff. What happens when all these layers are sort of interacting? I mean, the page itself is a frenzy, not let alone the action. The page is giving you that frenzy. So as I think about structuring pages, as I'm walking in New York or in a room or in a place in this room, start noticing how much the architecture around us, the landscape around us, has potential for thinking about how to make comic books. So if you look at the ceiling, a wonderful ceiling, thank you, Donald. Let's just pretend we put the ceiling to music. And so if I start in this ceiling panel, I might go and I sort of have a da, and then I hit the light and the light goes da, and then I hit the thing, and then I hit that fan, the vent, and it goes drrr, and then I keep going, and then there's sort of a solid thing, and continues. So you might imagine putting this to music. So I'm kind of intrigued by this. What are all these different shapes? What are they telling us? What kind of information is being told to us when you see those little dots near the edge of the subway, or how that's divided up, or why has this building got these things? What kind of information is being conveyed by that? So just a few other examples. Whoop, we're going to get. So the assignment. Well, lots of people in these talks will say, I really like what you're up to, and haven't said that yet. But what is the problem? They say, I get it, comics can do lots of stuff. But what is the problem? What is the problem everyone will tell me after that, for themselves personally? They say, I really like this, but I can't draw. So the idea of the exercise is to make something that reconsiders what drawing is and does it through making an abstract comic. So it's two parts that you'll do at once, but I have to explain them separately because I don't know how to talk non-linearly. But I'd like to. So the first half of this is you take the entire sheet of the paper you have, and how would you take it and carve it up in the sort of ways that comics carve up space, divided into boxes, whatever. I don't want to tell you too much because I don't want to influence how you carve your page up. But think about the whole surface as your day. That whole thing on that whole sheet of paper is your day. And how would you arrange the space in whatever the kinds of things I've shown or whatever you come up with that says, this is what my day looked like, or a day. You can pick a day that is whatever. I don't care which day it is. It doesn't have to be today. So how would you compose that space to speak to the shape of your day, how it unfolded? Does that make sense? Oh, all right. That look was like, but really the look was, I don't know what I'm going to do. But that's okay. So the second part of it, so as I'm about to, I had this thought right before the class I was going to teach, and I was on a run on the boardwalk, and I was running over this gridded thing, and there was spilled paint splashed across the thing. And that reminded me of my wife's work, who's here, who is an abstract gestural artist. And so much of her work is about expressing emotion or emotion through the thrown paint, through how this line cuts through space. So this is 2 little examples from her work. This is an example of oil or something spilled on a sidewalk. So the idea is, so you've got this grid, or it doesn't have to be grid, but you've cut up your space to convey the shape of your day. And then I want you to think about, in this sort of gestural line, any kind of line you want to make, that runs through it, animates it in some way that speaks to your motion or emotion in those moments. And I gave you another example. This was paint, not the same one that I saw that day. Or even this, if you can see it, this river running through somewhere over Ohio. You know, what does that line mean? So is this clear? In 5 minutes, can you carve up the shape of your day? And so drawing skills are not required. You need to be able to carve up one. And when I say use the whole page, I really mean it. That doesn't mean you can't leave giant spots blank, but they mean just as much as the spaces you fill. So what I don't want it, the only sort of requirement is that you don't like use half of it and say, well, I just was done. This is text you can scroll and you can be done wherever you want to be done. But comics, you have to think of every inch. So if you leave a giant blank space, it's because there's a giant blank space in your day, and that's fine, but it should mean something. Is this clear? Any more I tell you, then you'll do it what I would do, and I try not to do this because I don't want to know. So like 5, maybe 6 minutes. And then a few brave volunteers will share. Do you need a surface? You sure?
Yeah.
I can get you one. Surface. Should I tell the other people what we're doing? Should I tell them? All right, I can't do that. I can't. Everyone following online, you can do it as well and send us what you're doing.
Send you an email address.
Yeah. That's fine. Do you have tax? Basta, do you have tax?
I'll do a tax.
doing this in pen.
You guys are brave. I got him. Plenty. Time? Yeah, we got text. Ooh. They'll know? Oh. Do I have to say that?
Well, sure.
Where are these people?
We have tape.
Cool. Text will be fine. Oh. But there's only a little. Okay.
Yeah, actually.
Yeah. Okay, so we're going to do 30 more seconds. These don't, if I finished a page as quickly as you all do, I'd finished my dissertation a year ago. Good? So, suggestion from the audience is that we put these up. We were going to share them, but this is even better. So there's tax. Just all on one side. All on one side, just real quick. Tax are here. And we'll just have a couple of you talk about them, only because of other things to do today. But come on up. And if the video happens to catch the people putting tax in the wall, awesome. Yeah, I got all these out.
All right.
There's no contest or no prizes. No prizes, I'm sorry.
No problem.
Can I have one for number
You may. All right. Oh, more? You're very serious on your tack use.
Thank you.
Oh, text.
Thank you.
Take as many as you need.
What's good?
30. Make that part of the piece. Do you have tax over it in the back? All right. Maybe we'll look for a second and then we'll... Funny, no matter what, no matter how many times I say it's about making an abstract thing just about the grid and the line, some of you will always draw things. And that's okay. So who'd like to say a word about theirs?
James would.
Yeah.
James.
All right.
Where's yours, James? Oh, yes.
Okay. It should be like Dieter on Saturday Night Live, right? Here's my art right here. Okay. So let's explain to yourself the concept. So, yeah, basically what I was trying to capture is that, each day sort of has roughly defined like a start point and an end point.
Yeah.
And there's like a bunch of different ways you can sort of get there,
Ah.
right? And then it's all, and then these are sort of like my ridiculous daydreams or excursions. So it's like, this is sort of like what the man wants me to do, So like, I wake up, I eat breakfast, I take a shower, whatever, I go to work, I come home, whatever. But then sort of connected all this is, I'm a Tomb Raider, hunting aliens, stuff like that. And so there's basically sort of like an interconnection between that. So it's sort of like a flow too. So, I get down here, I go to sleep, whatever, but then, I'm dreaming or whatever. The dreams somehow turn to birds, that part I don't quite understand. And then, yeah, so I start again.
Nice. So immediately, are you a drawer?
I draw a little bit on my
We have a
script.
slight ringer in here, but but the
I
point
read
is,
a lot of comics too.
I knew that. Really.
Yeah.
But immediately, whether you can or not, we know right away that this means something. All of us knew without his explanation that some sort of dream time happened here. And we knew that there was more rigid structured time here, and we knew the flow. So these are comics that kind of need some explanation, but we're already making choices on how to organize space because of things that we implicitly know. And so let's take another one that, thanks James, I always have firsts of like, I don't know if I've had one that has that many choices in the reading. Cool. Who else needs to volunteer? Good heavens.
I'll go.
Donald.
I'm always great. So I was thinking mine sequentially. I drew things.
You drew
I
things.
drew I started filling things in because I had time left over. So
Yeah.
I was going for extra credit bars. So I kind of had like, my sleep time up here, like waking up in the middle of the night and then getting some sleep and then getting up and thinking about the floor plan of my house and just I started thinking about everything in boxes and I started realizing that I live entirely in boxes.
Mhm.
And there's boxes in my rooms and the path I take, which is generally the same and constrained. And there's, here's where I pick up my phone, that's where I pick up my coffee. Looking at my phone is a Windows phone, it's full of boxes.
Mm-hmm.
I see the little boxes on my phone, and I realize like my Outlook is like a little box, and I'm playing a chess game, which is like on a grid of boxes, and I put them on parts of my body, and then I get into either the individual person box or the multi-person box, depending on my day. That's my big choice there, is the box in the car. And go to the big box, which has 4 series of boxes that I walk up the stairs and kind of go around into my little box here, where I sit and I look at 3 different boxes with boxes inside of them, and that's kind of my day. So,
Fantastic.
yeah.
So I mean, right there, you haven't made comics before, have you?
Not really, I guess. I don't know.
Oh.
I draw things.
Oh, well, all right, I don't.
So I do.
I'm wondering,
I do draw. I like to draw my friends as various animals of my own devising. So yes, I do.
It's a
that.
later
It's
exhibition.
time now, you know.
But I mean, you've made choices like all of a sudden there's all these little tiny boxes in there, and then there's the big boxes when you move here, and maybe you made them just because that's how you filled the space because you were doing stuff and then you had more left over, or
You
maybe
told me I had to fill the space.
I did. But I mean, all those choices, were, for instance, this is a very short amount of time, right?
Yeah.
This is you getting ready. So there's all these little, there's all these little moments that are happening as you're getting ready. And there's sort of the expanse of travel and then the longness of your day. So, I mean, those kinds of things are written into there instantly as, you make those choices so that's it. It's good.
Do you read poems?
Poems?
Yeah, like I feel like I need my poems.
No. So I need somebody who made one very abstractly to speak up.
What about that one, the red squiggle?
Yeah, the red squiggle.
The red squiggles?
Is that you?
That one?
The red in the center.
Oh yeah, that's me. All right, well, I don't know if you guys can see it, but I do a lot of work with heart rate and galvanic skin response, and I've been seeing a lot of these lines and these jaggy things, and so what I did is I thought about my heart rate and my skin response throughout the day, and I thought, well, when I get up in the morning, I'm really calm, and I have my coffee, and I'm hanging out with my cats. I'm in the yard. There's like birds, and my heart rate is really, soft and really nice. And then there's the 5:20 commute. You're like You get into work, and there's like a million emails. And you're like blah, right? And so I have little people on the blips.
Yeah.
And that's when it becomes, usually by midday, super crazy, like interns running around and projects blowing up, or we have wins and losses, and then it kind of starts to subside again as I get home and then I get back into the swing of life outside of work. So I kind of used sort of the Richter scale sort of heart rate to do it.
But we know, the thing is that we know sort of a smooth line, whether you're a drawer or not, that means something. A smooth line means something different than a jagged line. And it may mean slightly different things depending on the context. But we know sharp lines because we live in a world where sharp things hurt, or where steep things are hard to climb. And we know soft curves mean something different. So whether you're a drawer or not a drawer, you can do these things. So, a big part of this, and we'd spend a lot more time on it, is to say, well, drawing doesn't have to look like things that look like things. It has to look like things that we feel. And we feel that line. You can look at, and I think all of these, you can pretty much start to look and you say, and there's a lot of coffee. Every time I do this, there's coffee, and usually drawn. It's the most persistent theme. And driving is a toss-up. But that sort of softness and the energy, those things come out, and you recognize it immediately. And everyone, or I mean, there's portrait style, there's landscape style. You guys have, some are circular. I think there's one, I think Nathan, yours starts to go in a circle, or maybe it's not done, I don't know which.
It was going to just be a big field of the different structures of thought that happened in my day.
Yeah,
And you could just...
you could go in any, yours is sort of all over.
Yeah.
All right, do we want one last word from one audience member, and then I'll close up the talk? Somebody else need to, you
I'll say something.
can always count on your wife to have a, know exactly what you need them to say.
Well, I realized when I got to the second part, like first I was dividing up my...
So wait, yours is that
It's
the,
the red one next to the first one we discussed.
Jennifer, it's
Kinda hard
right-
to see.
Jennifer, right next to you. Is that Jen?
Yeah, that one.
Yes, thank you for modeling that.
I realized after I kind of divided up my space that drawing a line within the divided up space felt extraneous. Like I was just repeating what I had already conveyed through cutting up the space.
Ah,
So it was just repeating myself.
Yeah.
And I
that's
don't know,
interesting.
that's
So
just-
you'd conveyed so much through the space already that you didn't need anything.
Right. Like I felt like I had already done that.
Yeah, interesting. Fair enough. And I think that's, I mean, there's a lot of educational comics coming now, and a lot of things, and it's really exciting. But I think this sort of, I think that our fallback on making comics and things like that is to lean towards illustration, to have the text do most of the work and the images sort of hold the text. But I think what you guys are doing, which is more advanced than a lot of things I see sometimes, drawing skill is separate from that, is that you're thinking about how the space, and if you've already organized the space in ways that said what you needed to say, it's possible you don't need any other information. And as I've said, the composition is the slowest thing for me, is how do I fit all these pieces that move the reader the way I want them to move, or let them choose, depending on, and how does that space, in the same way, you go to a museum and it's sort of, you have a guide, you have like the audio guide, and it's sort of, you have choices, but you have a guide, and that experience of the space is what you're trying to orchestrate with the comics. It's less about how do I draw a really nice picture of Batman, which has its appeal as well. But anyhow, so let me wrap this up, and then we'll take any questions and go to the other space. So what I said before the exercise is that comics really let us represent our thinking in ways that you guys have all demonstrated. But I think the flip side of that, and I think it's also demonstrated here in the ways that you've started, a few of you at least, and if we had time we could talk to all of you, started to discover things you didn't know about what you were thinking or about. So for me, this sort of play, this spatial play of image and text in the space of the page, it starts to open possibilities for me that I don't expect, because I make scribbles, and there's a whole table now of my scribbles out there, that my interaction between my eyes and the thing I scribbled on the paper, I start to see new possibilities, because now my eyes are interacting with that drawing. Okay, and so that play, so I see all these parts work, and oh wow, well, that's kind of interesting how that fits with that. So new possibilities open, and I say this a lot, I think that my interaction with my sketches is smarter than I am. So I think the things that I create in conversation with my drawings become smarter than what I know, because now I've got this tool, very simple tool. It's a pencil or pen or whatever, and a sheet of paper that I organize my thinking on. But it opens possibilities, and we sort of see the unexpected because we make combinations that we don't anticipate. This next to that suddenly produces a new thing. So sort of to wrap this all back to education, as we started, I really want to say that we're not flat. We're so far from being flat. And so when we think about comics and visual thinking, when we think about having art in schools and things like that, and the importance of it. The importance of art, I think, yeah, it's great that we produce artists, and it's great that we think about aesthetics and culture, but I don't think that's all of it. What all of it is that we're introducing a way of seeing the world. And I think when we're armed not just with one way of seeing the world, but when we're able to come from two, we can see something that from head on was very flat, but now we can see that, it has sides, because I can see around it, and I can turn it over, and I can flip it open, and all these possibilities open. So education, instead of becoming that sort of conveyor belt that I drew at the beginning, becomes more like a journey that we're experiencing, and the possibilities open. And and again, this is very much like the kinds of drawings that you guys did. It's like that abstract thing conveys a lot of things. There's a lot of meaning in how all the forks and how the words speak to them. And this is a different thing than those straight lines I drew at the beginning. So I think thinking about comics, thinking about visual thinking alongside our verbal, putting multiple modes together, I think it opens possibilities for how we teach and how we think and how we learn and make meaning in this world. So thank you for your time, and we'll do some questions. Thank you. Oops, I think Nathan.
Sure. One of the things I'm very interested in, coming from a background of literature,
Yeah.
and you're thinking about, like, say, some of Plato's arguments about the theater as well.
Yeah.
He really
No, yeah, he
disliked
didn't
the
like
theater.
And he didn't like
reasons.
writing that much either, so I know that I sort of simplified it there.
And one of the things that I'm curious about is the degree to which you feel like comics and this kind of expression can participate in conversation. Because we have a lot of strategies, like summarization, that allow us to have really efficient and long-term and in-depth conversations and dialectic around each other's works. And I'm wondering if you know of examples or you've explored this world of like people talking to each other through these visual forms.
Instagram?
Yeah. So if I'm I'm not sure I totally do. This might be a long conversation. Are you saying where people have actually exchanged comics as their way of communicating?
Yeah.
Is that? I don't know. I like it, and I can't answer that because I don't know, and I think that sounds like a neat project that we could talk about. But I think what comics can do really well is let you see more than one way of thinking at once. In the way that sort of James very much did that, but all of them, because when you introduce a sort of multimodal and multi-directional elements into it, that you open possibilities for what the meaning is. So you might read, you might read this page one time, and this is fairly linear despite its forkiness, and see one set of things, but you might see it slightly differently the second time around. And I can say something like Watchmen, each time you read it, there's other things that happen, and that's certainly true of text as well. I don't think it's not, but I think comics in that way that you look and read and look and that's a question I get a lot. Which do you do first? You read the text first and say yes. I mean, do you look first or do you read the text? I say yes. You do what you do, and everybody does it differently, and each page demands different things. So there's no answer to your question except we should try it.
Awesome.
Joe or James?
Joe, what's your methodology? How do you start? How do you end? For example, some artists do a whole bunch of sketches.
Yeah.
They do a whole bunch of studies.
Yeah.
Do you have a vision of where you're going and where you've come from and all through the project, or do you a whole bunch of different things and then see how they fit together? How do you fit it all together?
A lot of it's out there on that table. You'll see a lot of the preparatory things. What I do, there's a master layout. Like, I know where I'm headed. So there's some drawings and there's some words and there's like this thing that sort of breaks down where I'm headed. So there's that. And then from that, I tend to type up so the typing is sort of a scaffold for me. Like, here's all the things I might use and in some order that I might use them. And so I have it with me. I have like this massive document with references, stuff that's sort of in the order that I might use. I don't write stories in this. These are really philosophical excursions. So, if I was writing a story, I would have to break things down like to dialogue, etc. But I don't do that. So from that, as I get to pages that I'm actually working on, this is my thinking. This is like, all right, this page is about how comics let you find unexpected connections. So, the shape of it should have something to do with the sort of lateral thinking, it should have something to do with nonlinear. So there's more sketches probably. So this one was particularly difficult to think about because I was trying to convey something that was not linear and have it be readable still. So there was a ton of things like, all right, well, so it's going to need to be lots of little pieces, and the little pieces almost could kind of move around. So I had this idea of the shape. I had some words, but mostly not. So I keep playing and like, oh, well, all right, what if this line runs through it? And like, but that's kind of linear. And at some point that line was like this, and I don't know if these are in order. At some point this line like, oh, well, that line and that line, oh, that is sort of, that's not the final, but it's one of the ones. At some point, like, there it is. So now that's sort of some scaffold. So now where do these words fit? And so now here's some, all right, there's a word, and these are shorthand for whatever longer words I might write. So then that says something to what the image is. So now the image and the words that I have sort of roughly down are talking to each other. And then say, well, that image suggests a totally different bit of text there. So now I'm going to have to, so there's this constant, it's this insane feedback system that's going and going and going. And that's why I'm so slow. I mean, it's really not, it's not so slow because I can't draw an eye in a few minutes or something. It's because how those pieces start, they have this conversation, and I often feel like I'm just kind of there. Like I have to bear witness to this thing that I've laid out, and it has to tell me what to do. And I feel like as I've gone, I mean, the first chapter, which is mostly what's up there, it's the very dark, these figures, that's a little more straightforward narrative, and it's a little more intentional because in these ways, I mean, this is the first of these things. I wanted to make sure people knew that I could draw things that look like things, and then I wanted to sort of hit them in the face with a tour de force of drawing. Like, this is drawing. This is what you know is drawing. So that when I get to things where it's much more abstract, that they already know that, all right, he knows what an arm looks like, so now we trust him when he goes here. I felt like if I started in this point, it would have been, it would have been a little trickier. I'm not sure that's true, but does that sort of? Yeah. Okay. James.
So just from the mechanistic perspective, do you do your own inking and your own lettering? Because when you read a comic from DC or whatever,
yeah,
there's like
I do it.
Half of like thousands.
No, but if you'd like to be on staff, if you're looking for
an unpaid internship, awesome.
Yes. From Microsoft to unpaid internship, all in one day.
Hopefully no healthcare. And then my second question was.
No, I do it all. There's no, and I'll tell you, I would give that away here. This is not drawn on computer, but my final everything is, and mostly because I cannot letter physically. I have some sort of issue with letters. So I use fonts, and it allows me to keep playing with things after. I mean, it's still drawn by my hand, but it's drawn on my hand on a computer. Anyway, sorry, second?
And then, just right. So who are you reading right now? Like, what comics do you read? What do you think is
most of it? What do I read regularly, or what do I think is good? Those are two very different questions.
Just explore the studio space, whatever you feel comfortable revealing.
I mean, things I recommend. Says the guy in the Green Lantern shirt. Yeah.
Self-citation.
Yeah. Things I think are really good and worth reading. I mean, I think Chris Ware, which I showed, is worth reading. They're hard. I mean, they're sort of sad things, but they're worth thinking about how he organizes. Alan Moore's works, which there are less new of all the time, are really worth reading. Stitches by David Small. It's a graphic novel about sort of a memoir about growing up in Detroit and having a pretty traumatic childhood. It's very cinematic in how this is sort of an interesting parallel. There's Stitches, which is about his childhood, and then there's a book called Fun Home, which won a ton of awards by Alison Bechdel, which is a very literary thing. There are tons of text, but they're both about childhoods, about their childhoods, both about sort of similar issues going on in their homes, but as dramatic. One is a lot like film in how it moves, and the other one is a ton like Joyce in how it's got lots of words. So those are kind of, I've had my students do both at the same time to kind of see the range of what comics can do. I think there's a ton on that note. There's a ton in sort of memoir narratives. There's this upswelling of stories around traumas that happen in people's lives, and I think comics speak particularly well to that because they can get at some things that words don't handle very well. And I just one more side note, and maybe I'll take another. There's a group at Columbia in narrative medicine, sort of looking at how stories deal with health and ideas of health. And professors from that came to my class because they were using comics, but they didn't know a lot about how comics work. So they've then, they've just been eating up comics. And there's so much around health issues. I think that's one of the more interesting things. I mean, it doesn't mean it's all good, but we can talk about superheroes later. Jennifer.
You already started answering my question
Oh.
because I wanted a bibliography of people you quote or give examples of or that you think are really, interesting to read up on. And I started trying to keep notes and I couldn't get everybody.
Yeah.
So I was wondering, how do you spell Chris Ware's last name, or is there a title I can search?
Chris, W-A-R-E. It's Jimmy Corrigan, boy, smartest kid on earth. Is that right? Smartest kid? Yeah, but Building Stories, he just put out, smartest kid on, Jimmy Corrigan, it comes in a box like a game. You guys should have one in the lobby at Microsoft Research, come on. And it's apparently all these separate stories. I have it, but I'm not opening it until I have time to look at it. But there are all these separate stories in different formats. And he's really, as things have become digital and you can kind of stick everything on a screen, there's a big push by comic makers to also make things that are objects and take advantage of the different ways you read. So Chris Ware is really wonderful for that. You can ask, you're welcome to email me and I'll give you a recommended reading.
Are we going to be able to look at your slides, or?
Well, you can look at the work itself.
Yes.
Okay.
And this is also recorded, so you can,
Oh, okay.
yeah.
This is all recorded
And I post,
yeah,
I-
your blog.
sorry, I got excited. But it's on the booklet if you got it, and I have cards too. But I post my dissertation as I go. That was another one of those things I thought, why not? I was posting my comics as I go, why not post my dissertation? Apparently that's not done. I don't know why people don't want to read chapters from dissertations on blogs. But yeah, so as I go, as I finish a new page or sequence, I put it up so you can, yeah. And I can answer any of those individually as well. I mean, do we want to take one more or should we cut it?
We should cut it because.
We have to cut it.
But
That's it.
we're not really cutting it. We're just moving to a new space.
We're transforming.
Yeah. So I just wanted to say that we have this exhibition right now we're going to open in like 8 minutes. So I'm hoping to get everyone out there. We have a tradition here at MSR for the last 10 years or so to have an end of month drink and eat sort of thing. Today, they kind of did a switch on us at the last minute, and they moved out to the back patio, and they changed the beer and wine to Guinness ice cream floats, which, according to the prenatal, postnatal expert in the room, are excellent for producing breast milk. So that's good for all of us, I think. And but what I'd like to do is I'd like to move us out there. We have some prints of Nick's there. We have some prints of Nick's there, and we have on the columns we have a lot more stuff. We've got a book for you to page through. Nick actually he did a drawing earlier today of this talk in comic form that's up on a dry erase board, and he also has a draft of the next page in the 3rd chapter that he's working on. It's out there in rough form. I'd also like to take these. I think I'm going to try to pin these and put a little shrine and say these were produced, from him. So if you don't want that to happen, then,
Well, this is a portrait of him right there.
oh, excellent, perfect. So
Such a great
come out,
likeness,
come
yeah.
out, talk to him.
that?
So here's my master plan. This is how we're going to take over the world. We're going to go out to the patio, going to get yourself some Guinness and root beer, and try to grab some stranger and say, come in, we're going to open up the show, and bring people in for us in the next 8 minutes, okay? So we're going to see a lot more of Nick because we've got some plans to build educational tools with him for little kids and leverage Microsoft technology in all kinds of weird ways, which I can't talk about now because it's totally secret.
And I turned the mic off, so we're all right.
Yeah, but that's for later. For now, let's just give him one round of thanks again.